The sharp hum of a jet engine reverberated across the quiet lounge of Skyhaven Airlines. The business-class cabin gleamed under soft, ambient lighting, its leather seats arranged in perfect symmetry. Amelie's hand rested lightly on the handle of her cabin bag. She moved toward her assigned seat. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if she belonged here, not just to this row of privilege, but to the moment itself. Yet, as she settled into the window seat, an invisible storm began to stir. Across the cabin, Megan, a seasoned flight attendant with a reputation for efficiency, paused mid-step. Something about Amelie caught her attention, a dissonance she couldn't name. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence of a young woman, clad in a simple but elegant outfit that hinted at understated wealth. Or maybe it was her poise, the way she held herself like she had nothing to prove. Megan's instincts, honed over years of service, whispered doubt. Amelie seemed too calm, too unaffected by the exclusivity of the space. As Megan approached, her polished demeanor masked the flicker of judgment that danced across her mind. "Excuse me," she began, her tone polite yet firm. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Amelie turned her head, meeting Megan's gaze with eyes that held an unspoken challenge. Her expression betrayed neither annoyance nor surprise, just quiet composure. She reached into her bag and retrieved her phone, the glow of the screen illuminating the small row as she opened her digital ticket. "Here it is," she said softly, extending it without hesitation. Megan leaned closer, her eyes scanning the details. For a fleeting moment, her brow furrowed. Skyhaven Airlines, business class, the ticket read. Everything seemed legitimate, yet Megan hesitated. She straightened, her professional smile thinning. "Thank you," she said curtly, handing the phone back. "I'll need to double-check something with the front desk." "Please remain seated." Amelie's fingers tightened around the phone as Megan walked briskly down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking toward Amelie like silent spotlights. She could feel their curiosity prickling at her skin, their unspoken questions forming a chorus of whispers. Who is she? What did she do? But Amelie didn't move. She exhaled slowly, staring out the window at the sprawling tarmac beyond, where planes lined up like silent sentinels waiting for their cue to ascend. Her reflection in the glass was steady, but a faint crease of tension touched her brow. The cabin was no longer just a space. It was a stage, and she the unwilling performer. At the front of the plane, Megan stood beside the purser, her voice a low murmur as she described her concerns about the passenger in C3A. "Something's off," she said. "I just want to confirm her ticket is valid before we take off." The purser glanced at her, his expression neutral but edged with caution. "Megan, we're not in the business of judging passengers based on instinct. If the ticket scans, it's valid." Megan hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I understand," she said finally, but her tone carried the weight of unresolved doubt. Back in her seat, Amelie caught the faint murmurs around her. A man across the aisle leaned toward his companion, whispering, "Probably a mistake." "She doesn't look like—" He stopped, his sentence unfinished but clear in implication. Amelie's jaw tightened. She lowered her gaze to her phone, where a new message from her father flashed across the screen. "Let me know if there's any trouble." "Stay calm." She smirked faintly, typing back a single word. "Always." As Megan returned, her steps less certain now, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. She stopped beside Amelie, her professional veneer firmly in place. "Miss," she began, "I'm sorry, but your ticket is not registering correctly in our system. We may need to reassign you to a different seat temporarily until we confirm." Amelie turned to face her fully, her expression unreadable. "And if I say no?" she asked softly, her tone devoid of aggression but layered with meaning. For a moment, Megan faltered. The calm defiance in Amelie's voice was disarming, and something in her gut told her she'd miscalculated. But she pressed on, determined to maintain control of the situation. "Miss, we simply need to follow protocol," Megan said, her voice sharper now. "If you'll just—" Amelie cut her off with a quiet, pointed reply. "Do what you need to do. But before you proceed, I suggest you speak with the captain. I believe he's expecting my call." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Megan felt the balance of power shift. As Megan retreated once more, the murmur of passengers grew louder, their curiosity morphing into speculation. Amelie remained still, her fingers tracing the edge of her phone, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. The chessboard was set, and she was already 3 moves ahead. Outside, The engines roared to life, a reminder that this flight was only just beginning. But for Amelie, the journey had started long before she ever stepped foot on the plane. The cabin hummed with the subdued rhythm of pre-flight preparations. Megan's footsteps echoed through the aisle, her movements precise but strained, as if the weight of her earlier encounter with Amelie had left an invisible mark. She had retreated to the galley under the guise of protocol, but the truth was far more personal. Doubt gnawed at her resolve, but pride wouldn't let her admit it, not yet. Amelie, meanwhile, sat unmoving in her seat. The soft glow of her phone screen illuminated her calm expression as she stared at an unsent message. Should I involve him now? Or let this play out? The question lingered, but her fingers hesitated above the keyboard. She tucked the phone away, her gaze shifting to the window where the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting the tarmac in hues of gold and shadow. The surrounding passengers, however, were less composed. The man across the aisle leaned toward his companion again, his whispers more audible now. You think she's one of those influencers? Bought a ticket just for the clout? His companion shrugged, smirking. Could be. Or maybe it's fake. Happens all the time. Amelie caught the exchange but gave no sign she had heard. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if tuning into a quieter, internal frequency. The whispers around her were nothing new. She had long since learned that silence was often the loudest weapon. At the front of the plane, Megan stood stiffly by the service desk, her tablet clutched tightly in her hands. The purser was busy addressing another matter, leaving her to wrestle with her suspicions alone. Her eyes flicked toward the cockpit door, the faint hum of voices behind it tempting her to interrupt. Finally, with a measured breath, she stepped forward and knocked lightly. The captain's voice carried through the door, calm but authoritative. Come in. Captain Thomas, a man of seasoned composure, turned his attention to Megan as she entered. His gaze was sharp, but not unkind, the sort of look that demanded precision in every interaction. What's the issue, Megan? He asked, his tone neutral. Megan hesitated for a fraction of a second before launching into her explanation. There's a passenger in 3A. Her ticket scanned, but something feels off. I just want to ensure everything is legitimate before we take off. Thomas raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. Off how? She doesn't fit, Megan said carefully, choosing her words as if they were fragile glass. She doesn't look like the type who usually flies business class. The room fell silent for a beat too long. Thomas's expression shifted, a flicker of disbelief crossing his features before settling into something colder. Megan, he began slowly, are you telling me you've singled out a paying passenger because they don't fit your personal expectations of what business class clientele should look like? Megan flushed, a faint heat crawling up her neck. I didn't mean it like that, she said quickly. I'm just trying to avoid a situation where we embarrass ourselves by doubting someone who has every right to be here. Thomas interrupted, his voice steady but pointed. You've been with Skyhaven long enough to know that assumptions have no place on this plane. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing minute. Amelie felt the stares lingering on her like a slow burn, every glance and whispered comment feeding the simmering tension. The murmurs were a low tide, ebbing and flowing but never fully receding. A flight attendant approached her row, her smile strained as she offered a bottle of water. For you, miss, she said quietly, her tone laced with something unspoken, an apology, an acknowledgement. Amelie accepted it without a word, her fingers brushing the condensation-covered surface as she placed it on her tray table. The man across the aisle leaned forward again, emboldened by the silence. See? They're probably just trying to keep her calm, he muttered to his companion, loud enough for Amelie to hear. Bet they're calling security right now. Amelie finally turned her head, meeting his gaze with a look so steady it made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. You shouldn't believe everything you assume, she said simply, her voice like the edge of a blade, sharp but controlled. The man looked away, mumbling something incoherent. His companion chuckled nervously, and the whispers subsided, but the tension in the air remained palpable. In the cockpit, Thomas tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the armrest of his chair. He had heard enough. Bring me her information, he said to Megan, his tone leaving no room for argument. And next time, Megan, remember that every passenger on this flight deserves respect, regardless of how they seem to you. Megan nodded stiffly, retreating to the galley with her tablet in hand. As she scrolled through the passenger manifest, her eyes landed on a name that made her stomach drop. Amelie Harrison. Harrison. The name was unmistakable. Megan froze, the realization hitting her like a gust of turbulence. She turned toward the cockpit, but her steps faltered. For the first time, she questioned not the passenger, but herself. The murmurs in the cabin had settled into a low hum, but the tension lingered like static in the air. Amelie remained still, her gaze fixed on the horizon outside the window. The amber hues of the sunset painted the clouds in strokes of fire and gold, a fleeting serenity that contrasted sharply with the unease crackling around her. In the galley, Megan's hands trembled slightly as she stared at the passenger manifest. The name Harrison stared back at her, heavy with implications. She glanced toward the cockpit door, her earlier confidence now replaced by a sinking realization. She had misjudged not only Amelie but the situation as a whole. Her internal battle was interrupted by the purser, who stepped into the galley with a raised brow. "What's going on, Megan?" "The captain's been asking for an update." Megan hesitated, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. I think I made an error," she admitted quietly, her voice barely audible above the soft hum of the plane. "She's Harrison's daughter." The purser's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "You mean that, Harrison? As in the CEO of Skyhaven?" Megan nodded slowly, her throat tightening. The purser let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "You'd better fix this before the captain gets involved any further." Back in the cabin, Amelie noticed Megan re-emerging from the galley, her steps slower, more deliberate. The flight attendant's polished exterior seemed to falter, a crack in the armor of professionalism. Amelie's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, not one of triumph, but of quiet recognition. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Megan approached cautiously, her gaze avoiding direct contact with Amelie's as she stopped beside her seat. "Miss Harrison," she began, her voice softer than before, "I've spoken with the captain, and we've confirmed your ticket is valid. I apologize for the inconvenience." Amelie tilted her head slightly, studying Megan with an unreadable expression. "Inconvenience," she repeated, her tone light but edged with irony. "Is that what we're calling this?" The question hung in the air, delicate but cutting. Megan shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It wasn't my intention to make you feel unwelcome," she said, her voice faltering. Amelie's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before she leaned back in her seat. "Intentions are interesting things," she said finally, her voice calm yet firm. "They often matter less than the impact they have." The cabin, though subdued in its activity, was far from unaware. Passengers exchanged furtive glances, the earlier whispers now replaced by quiet speculation. The man across the aisle shifted uneasily, his earlier assumptions now weighing heavily in the silence. Amelie turned her head slightly, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach him without appearing confrontational. "Funny how quickly people form opinions without knowing the whole story, isn't it?" The man stiffened, his face reddening as he muttered an inaudible response. His companion nudged him, whispering something under his breath, and they both sank deeper into their seats. Megan remained by Amelie's side, professional facade slipping further. "If there's anything I can do to make this right." Amelie raised a hand, cutting her off gently but decisively. "What you can do," she said, her voice steady, "is reflect on why this happened in the first place. That's the only way it doesn't happen again." The words were neither harsh nor forgiving. They were a simple truth, delivered with the kind of calm that only came from experience. Megan nodded, her shoulders slumping slightly as she stepped back. In the cockpit, Captain Thomas observed the scene through the small monitor linked to the cabin security feed. His jaw tightened as he watched Megan retreat to the galley. Picking up the intercom, he spoke with the authority of someone who had seen enough. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," his voice crackled through the cabin. "I want to take a moment to thank you for flying with Skyhaven Airlines. At Skyhaven, we pride ourselves on providing exceptional service and respect to every passenger aboard." The words, though neutral in tone, carried an undertone that wasn't lost on the attentive. Amelie's lips twitched into a faint smile as she leaned her head against the window. The captain's message wasn't just for the passengers, it was for the crew as well. As the plane leveled out above the clouds, the tension began to dissipate, but Amelie's mind remained sharp. She reached for her phone, typing a quick message. "Everything's fine now. Thank you for trusting me to handle it." The reply came almost immediately. "You're stronger than they'll ever know." She locked the screen, her reflection in the window now bathed in moonlight. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Megan, on the other hand, stood frozen in the galley, her thoughts racing. For the first time in years, she felt the full weight of her actions, not just as a mistake, but as a reflection of something deeper. Her reputation for professionalism had always been her shield, but now it felt paper-thin. The captain's voice lingered in the cabin like the aftermath of a storm, calm but resolute. Every passenger felt its weight. The announcement, carefully worded to sound routine, carried undertones that left little doubt. Something significant had occurred. It revolved around the quiet figure seated in 3A. Amelie remained composed, her fingers tracing the condensation on the water bottle she hadn't touched. The faint murmurs that followed the captain's words were different now, less curious, more cautious. As if the realization had begun to settle. Who exactly is she? Megan stood frozen in the galley, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She replayed every moment in painstaking detail. The initial judgment, the demand for a ticket, the whispers in the cabin. Her professionalism had always been her anchor, yet here she was, untethered, forced to face the unspoken biases that had clouded her actions. The purser entered the galley, his expression unreadable. "The captain wants to speak with you," he said, his voice low but firm. Megan felt the knot in her stomach tighten. There was no escaping this now. As she made her way toward the cockpit, her steps felt heavier with each passing row. The passengers' gazes followed her like invisible spotlights, their curiosity and silent judgment pressing against her like a wave. She kept her eyes forward, but the weight of her mistake bore down on her with every step. Reaching the cockpit door, Megan knocked lightly. It opened almost immediately, revealing Captain Thomas seated with an air of quiet authority. His expression was calm but edged with something unmistakable, disappointment. "Megan," he said, motioning for her to step inside. "Close the door." She obeyed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The small space seemed to shrink as silence filled the air between them. "Explain," Thomas said simply, his tone leaving no room for evasion. Megan hesitated, her voice faltering as she began. I thought something was off about the passenger in 3A. Her demeanor, the way she carried herself, it didn't seem typical for business class. I thought I was protecting the integrity of the cabin." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "And did you stop to consider what message your actions sent to her? Or to the rest of the passengers?" Megan opened her mouth, but no words came. She had no defense. The truth was painfully clear now, and the shame of it sat like a stone in her chest. Thomas continued, his voice firm but measured. "Your job is not to question who belongs here. Your job is to ensure that every passenger feels welcomed and respected. This situation should never have escalated to this point." "I understand," Megan said quietly, her head bowing slightly. "It won't happen again." Thomas studied her for a long moment before nodding. "See that it doesn't. And I suggest you start by making things right with Miss Harrison." As Megan left the cockpit, her thoughts raced. The captain's words echoed in her mind, a reminder of the professionalism she had prided herself on but failed to uphold. She paused in the galley, taking a steadying breath before stepping back into the cabin. Amelie's seat was a beacon in the otherwise dimly lit space, her calm presence standing in stark contrast to the turmoil Megan felt within herself. Gathering her resolve, Megan approached with measured steps, stopping just short of the row. "Miss Harrison," she began, her voice quieter than usual. Amelie glanced up, her expression neutral but attentive. "I want to apologize," Megan continued, "for doubting you, for misjudging you, and for making you feel unwelcome. It was wrong, and I deeply regret my actions." Amelie studied her for a moment, her gaze steady. "And what have you learned from it?" she asked, her tone soft but pointed. The question caught Megan off guard, but it was one she knew she had to answer. "I've learned that assumptions, any assumption, have no place here. That every passenger deserves respect, regardless of how they appear or how I perceive them. And that I need to do better." Amelie's expression softened, though her composure remained intact. "Reflection is a start," she said simply. "But actions matter more." Megan nodded, the weight of those words sinking in. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere, "for giving me a chance to make this right." Amelie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the window, the faint outline of the city lights below, beginning to emerge as the plane prepared for its descent. "Just make sure the next person doesn't have to go through this," she said quietly. The cabin felt different now, quieter, almost contemplative. The earlier tension had given way to a strange kind of calm, as if the air itself had shifted. Passengers avoided meeting Amelie's gaze, their earlier curiosity replaced with an unspoken understanding. The man across the aisle, who had whispered his judgments so freely before, sat with his head bowed, the silence between him and his companion heavy with regret. As the plane descended through the layers of clouds, Megan retreated to the galley, her mind still turning over the events of the flight. She thought of the captain's words, of Amelie's calm resolve, and of the unspoken lessons that had unfolded in the confines of the cabin. It wasn't just a mistake she had made, it was a mirror held up to her own shortcomings. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane began its descent, the soft chime of the seatbelt sign cutting through the quiet hum of the engines. Amelie's gaze remained fixed on the glowing city below, its sprawling grid of lights a reminder of the world awaiting her. Yet, within the confines of the cabin, another moment loomed, one that would shift the delicate balance of the evening. Megan, now stationed at the galley door, adjusted her uniform with shaking hands. Her composure was returning in increments, though the sharp edge of regret lingered in her chest. She replayed Amelie's words in her mind, each one striking a deeper chord than the last. Reflection is a start, but actions matter more. The intercom crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," came the calm, steady voice of Captain Thomas. "As we begin our final descent into New York, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for choosing Skyhaven Airlines. We strive to provide all of our passengers with a respectful and comfortable experience." There was a pause, a moment of silence that stretched just long enough to draw attention. Earlier this evening, a misunderstanding occurred involving one of our passengers, Miss Amelie Harrison. I'd like to personally acknowledge that Miss Harrison is not only a valued guest but also the daughter of Skyhaven Airlines CEO, Richard Harrison. A ripple moved through the cabin, subtle but undeniable. The weight of the announcement settled on every passenger, and the whispers began again, but they carried a different tone now. Curiosity mingled with surprise, embarrassment, and a touch of reverence. Amelie didn't react outwardly to the captain's words. She remained seated, her hands loosely clasped in her lap, her face an unreadable mask of calm. But inside, a familiar mix of emotions churned: relief, frustration, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice prevail. Across the aisle, the man who had whispered about her earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His companion leaned toward him, whispering something inaudible, and they both avoided looking in her direction. Their silence spoke louder than words. Megan's heart sank further at the captain's announcement. The realization of how deeply she had erred, both in judgment and in action, struck her again with full force. For a moment, she considered retreating to the galley entirely, but something stopped her. She had promised herself and Amelie that she would do better, and that meant confronting this moment head-on. The plane's engines roared softly as the descent continued, the runway lights coming into view. Megan stepped into the aisle, her movements deliberate but measured, and approached Amelie's seat. She stopped just short of the row, her posture both formal and apologetic. "Miss Harrison," she said quietly, her voice just loud enough to carry over the ambient noise of the cabin. Amelie looked up, her expression neutral, though her eyes carried a flicker of curiosity. "I wanted to apologize again, not just as part of my duties, but as a person," Megan continued. "I was wrong to make assumptions about you, and I regret how my actions may have made you feel. There's no excuse for it. I just hope you can accept my apology." Amelie studied her for a long moment, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Then, with a slight tilt of her head, she replied, "I appreciate your apology, but as I said earlier, actions matter more." Megan nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I understand," she said, "and I'll make sure to carry this lesson forward." The interaction ended there, but the weight of it lingered. Megan returned to her station near the galley, feeling both relieved and humbled. Amelie turned her gaze back to the window, the city below now almost close enough to touch. As the plane touched down with a gentle jolt, the passengers stirred, the quiet buzz of activity returning to the cabin. Seatbelts clicked open, overhead compartments creaked as luggage was retrieved, and the hum of conversation filled the air. But amidst the routine, an unspoken tension lingered, an awareness of what had transpired during the flight. Several passengers glanced at Amelie as they passed a row, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something that resembled admiration. One older woman paused briefly, leaning slightly toward her and offering a kind smile. "You handled yourself beautifully," she said softly before continuing toward the exit. Amelie acknowledged the comment with a small nod, her expression unreadable. She didn't need validation from strangers, but the sentiment was not lost on her. Megan remained at her station as passengers disembarked, her eyes briefly meeting Amelie's as she passed. There was no exchange of words this time, only a quiet acknowledgement, a mutual understanding that some lessons are learned the hard way. As Amelie stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, the tension in her shoulders finally began to ease. The air was cooler here, less stifling, and she allowed herself a moment to breathe deeply. The journey wasn't over, but this chapter had closed, and she had emerged stronger for it. The airport was alive with its usual chaos. Announcements echoed through the terminal, luggage rolled across tiled floors, and passengers hurried to their destinations. Yet, for Amelie, stepping off the plane felt like emerging from a storm into the calm. The tension of the flight still lingered faintly, but the cool, sterile air of the jet bridge brought a sense of clarity. She walked steadily, her carry-on gliding smoothly behind her. The familiar rhythm of her steps was soothing, a reminder that the ground beneath her was steady again. Amelie's thoughts circled back to the flight, to the unspoken judgments, the whispers, and Megan's faltering apologies. The experience was not new to her, but it never failed to leave a mark, a quiet imprint of frustration and resilience. Behind her, Megan stood by the open cabin door, bidding farewell to passengers as they disembarked. Her usual cheerful farewells felt heavier, each smile a fragile mask barely concealing her inner turmoil. The memory of Amelie's calm but pointed words echoed in her mind. Reflection is a start, but actions matter more. As the last passenger exited, Megan stepped back into the now empty cabin. The hum of the engines quieted, and the space felt unnaturally still. She lingered for a moment, staring at the seat where Amelie had sat. The row seemed ordinary, but to Megan, it had become a mirror reflecting her own biases and mistakes. The purser approached, breaking the silence. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but probing. Megan nodded faintly. "I will be," she replied, though her tone carried the weight of uncertainty. "It's just, I've worked so hard to be professional, to treat everyone fairly. But tonight, I realized how blind I've been to my own assumptions." The purser crossed his arms, leaning slightly against the seat back. "The important thing is that you recognized it. Most people don't even get that far." Megan offered a weak smile. "Recognition is one thing. Fixing it is another." The purser nodded. "True. But you have a chance now to do better. That's what matters." His words settled over her like a quiet balm, a reminder that mistakes, while painful, could become stepping stones toward growth. Megan took a deep breath, straightening her posture. "Thanks," she said simply before turning back to her duties. The cabin needed to be prepared for the next flight, but Megan knew the real work was internal. At the arrivals gate, Amelie spotted her father, Richard Harrison, waiting near the edge of the crowd. His tall frame was unmistakable, his tailored suit and commanding presence exuding the confidence of a man who had built an empire in the skies. Yet his smile as he saw her was disarmingly warm, a reminder that beneath his corporate persona was a father who cared deeply for his daughter. Amelie he greeted, pulling her into a brief but firm embrace. "How was the flight?" She stepped back, her gaze steady. "It was interesting," she said with a faint smile. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Richard studied her face for a moment, a flicker of concern crossing his features. "You know, I can step in if you need me to. No one has the right to make you feel less than you are." Amelie shook her head. "I know, but it's better this way. If I call you every time, they'll never see me for who I am, just for whose daughter I am." Richard's expression softened, pride glimmering in his eyes. "You've always been stronger than most people give you credit for," he said. "But I hope you know I'm always here if you need me." "I know," she replied, her voice quieter now. "And I'm grateful for that." As they walked through the terminal, Amelie felt a strange sense of lightness. The events of the flight had left her tired, but they had also reinforced her resolve. She had faced judgment and condescension before, and she knew she would face them again. But each time, she emerged stronger, more certain of who she was and what she stood for. Back on the plane, Megan stood alone in the galley, the cabin now spotless and ready for the next set of passengers. She glanced at her reflection in the small window by the door. For years, she had seen herself as a professional, someone who prided herself on fairness and efficiency. Tonight, that image had cracked, revealing flaws she hadn't been willing to confront. But Amelie's words lingered, a quiet challenge that refused to fade. Actions matter more. Megan took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. Mistakes didn't define a person. How they responded to them did. And she intended to respond the right way, not just for Amelie, but for every passenger who stepped onto her flights. As Amelie and Richard exited the terminal into the crisp New York night, she looked up at the towering skyscrapers that lined the horizon. The city was alive, buzzing with opportunity and ambition. And for the first time that evening, Amelie allowed herself a moment of hope. She had faced judgment, but she had also stood her ground. In the grander scheme of things, this was just one flight, one of many journeys that would shape her story. The New York night was thick with the hum of city life, honking taxis, distant sirens, and the ceaseless chatter of pedestrians. The towering skyscrapers stood as silent witnesses to the countless stories unfolding beneath their shadows. For Amelie, the city was both a familiar landscape and a canvas waiting to be painted with new experiences. As she and Richard navigated the bustling streets, the rhythmic click of her suitcase wheels seemed to punctuate their quiet conversation. They walked side by side, an unspoken bond threading between them. The events of the flight lingered in the air, but neither felt the need to dissect them further. Some lessons they both knew were better left to settle naturally. In the solitude of her hotel room, Amelie set her luggage aside and moved toward the large window overlooking the cityscape. The city lights sparkled like scattered stars, each one a testament to the lives moving just beyond the glass. She traced patterns on the cold surface with her fingertips, letting the evening's events replay in her mind. The quiet dignity she had maintained, the whispered judgment she had endured, and Megan's fumbling apology, all of it melded into a lesson she had learned too many times before. The world, with all its grandeur and opportunity, was also a place rife with assumptions and biases. Yet each encounter only served to fortify her resolve, shaping her into someone who could face these moments with grace. A soft chime from her phone broke the silence. A message from Richard. "Remember, you carry our name, but you define its meaning. Proud of you always." Amelie's lips curved into a gentle smile. There was comfort in knowing that while the world might see her through the lens of her father's legacy, it was her actions that would redefine that legacy over time. Miles away, Megan sat alone in her modest apartment, the events of the day replaying relentlessly in her mind. The familiar surroundings offered little comfort against the relentless self-reflection that consumed her. Her uniform hung neatly in the closet, a symbol of the professionalism she had prided herself on. But tonight, it felt like a hollow facade. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. The temptation to send a formal apology, something polished and crafted, lingered. But Megan knew it wouldn't suffice. Amelie's words had cut deeper than any reprimand from a superior, leaving an imprint that demanded genuine change. Opening a blank note, Megan began to type, her words simple but sincere. "Today, I judge someone based on appearances and assumptions. I let my biases cloud my duty to serve with respect. To Miss Harrison and every passenger I've misjudged, I'm sorry. This is not who I strive to be, and I will do better." She read the message twice before saving it, a private promise to herself. Megan knew that real change required more than words. It demanded actions, conscious and deliberate, woven into the fabric of her daily interactions. The following morning, Amelie sat in a quaint cafe nestled between towering office buildings. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the distant sound of a street musician playing the saxophone. The world moved around her, oblivious to the quiet revelations of the night before. A folded newspaper lay on the table beside her untouched coffee. The headlines spoke of market shifts and political debates, but Amelie's attention was elsewhere. Her sketchbook lay open, pages filled with charcoal drawings that captured the raw emotions she rarely vocalized. Art had always been her sanctuary, a place where judgments dissolved into strokes and lines. Her phone vibrated, breaking her concentration. A message from an unknown number. "Miss Harrison, this is Megan from your flight yesterday. I wanted to thank you, not just for your patience, but for your grace. You've taught me more in a few hours than I've learned in years. I promise to carry this lesson forward." Amelie read the message twice, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she considered her response. Finally, she typed, "Growth is continuous, Megan. Every day is a new chance to be better. Take care." She sent the message, a sense of closure settling over her. It wasn't forgiveness she offered. It was the recognition that change, real and enduring, was possible. As the morning unfolded, Richard joined Amelie at the cafe, a subtle pride in his gaze as he took the seat opposite her. "Ready for today's meetings?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with genuine interest. Amelie closed her sketchbook, offering a small, confident smile. "Always." Their conversation drifted from business to art, from the mundane to the profound, each word a thread in the intricate tapestry of their relationship. For Richard, watching his daughter navigate the complexities of her world was both a challenge and a joy. For Amelie, the path ahead was clearer now, a journey shaped by resilience and integrity, unmarred by the shadows of doubt. In the days that followed, Megan approached her duties with renewed purpose. Each interaction, each passenger, became an opportunity to embody the lessons she had learned. The plane, once merely a vessel of travel, transformed into a space of respect and understanding, a place where judgments were replaced by curiosity and assumptions by empathy. Amelie, too, continued her journey. Each step was a declaration of her own worth, independent of the legacy that bore her name. And as she moved through the world, she carried with her the quiet strength that had been tested at 30,000 feet. In the tapestry of life, some threads are woven with gold, others with shadows. Yet, it is the interplay between the two that creates the most enduring stories. For Amelie and Megan, their flight was not just a journey through the skies, but a passage toward understanding of themselves, of each other, and of the delicate balance between judgment and grace.